I now call on Professor Peters, the Vice Chancellor of National Open University, for his welcome address and to declare the workshop open.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues out there, especially our collaborators and founder of this research project, the University of Notre Dame. My name is Femi Peters. I'm both the Vice Chancellor and also a participant. I want to welcome you to the official opening of this 8-week online workshop for lecturers of higher institutions in Nigeria. I understand that participants have been drawn across colleges of education, polytechnics, universities, and research institutes all over Nigeria. The theme of this online training is integrating AI ethics for teaching and research in Nigerian higher education. And it's been organized by a team of researchers at our university in collaboration with and funding support from the Notre Dame IBM Tech Ethics Lab based at the Notre Dame University in the USA. This workshop is especially significant because it sets out to equip participants with the necessary ideas and skills to utilize artificial intelligence in their teaching and research roles in a manner that is ethical and sustainable. It is self-evident that for now, in fact, in all our lives, AI permeates all aspects of human endeavor, and higher education is not an exempt in this development. Indeed, since the advent of ChatGPT in November of 2022, there is now more than ever before the need to rethink and rejig how we function as academics and lecturers across the many higher education spaces. The reason for this is not far-fetched. It is because of the impact of AI on research and academic integrity for both lecturers and students alike. We understand the challenges that AI brings, and this workshop is here to navigate them together with you. You will agree with me that there are more questions than answers as far as AI is concerned. For instance, we may ask, how do we know a work submitted by a student is indeed her work? Or how, should students even be allowed to use AI assistance to prepare their submissions? Or how do we incorporate AI into our teaching and research in a honest and transparent manner? Or we might even ask, are we at the risk of losing our sense of creativity and originality due to our over-reliance or over-dependence on AI? These are some of the issues that I think we'll address during this workshop. I strongly encourage all participants to give this workshop the attention it deserves for mainly two reasons. One, AI has come to stay, and it demands different forms of relearning, unlearning, and reskilling, some of which I believe this workshop will afford. The second issue is that this workshop is one of its kind, with a unique focus on the ethics and sustainability of AI utilization for Nigerian higher education lecturers. The ethical aspects of AI is certainly not an area that has received necessary attention in our context. So this workshop is meant to serve that purpose. I have had an opportunity to look at the list of guest speakers, and I can attest to the fact that the research team have assembled a coterie of seasoned local and international speakers who have been intentionally recruited to deliver key presentations during each week of this online course. So I want to urge you to attend the live sessions as required on Mondays and Fridays, and also engage and share ideas on the discussion forum and attempt the quizzes and the final assessment. Your participation in this unique workshop is a testament to your commitment to ethical and sustainable use of AI in our teaching and research in our higher education system. Please try to give it your all. And finally, I congratulate you on being among the 300 academics out of tens of thousands of higher education lecturers in Nigeria who have been selected to participate in this important workshop. Strive to be among those that receive the certificate of completion, and if possible, certificate of completion with distinction at the end of the course. On behalf of the organizers, I wish you all the very best for this 8-week professional development journey. And I therefore declare the workshop open. Thank you very much.
I'll present Professor Nuno Moniz's bio, who is our guest speaker for the week. Professor Nuno Moniz is an associate research professor at the Lucy Family Institute for Data and Society. He is also the director of the Notre Dame IBM Technology Ethics Lab and the associate director of the Data Inference Analytics and Learning Lab. Moniz, who joined the University of Notre Dame in 2022, is an expert on machine learning, investigating challenges such as imbalanced learning and rare event detection, data privacy, and model interpretability, for which he has won multiple awards internationally. He is particularly interested in interdisciplinary efforts to understand the real-world impact of automated systems. Please join me to welcome Professor Moniz as he makes his presentation. Professor Moniz, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ellen. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I wanted to just reinforce Dr. Peter's comments. I think this workshop is definitely one in a kind. And it was a pleasure on our end to review it and discuss it and analyze its merits, which are certainly very great. And I think there's a part there that Dr. Peters touched, which is something that personally echoed with me looking at this proposal and this ambition to organize this, which is the necessary discussion that we also need to have concerning what is higher education for in light of all of the AI developments and students picking up AI, all of this conversation about creativity, human development, and flourishing. So what are we doing as educators, and how do we navigate this new reality? And I think this workshop is the type of step that we all should ambition for, regardless of where we are in the world. But particularly for us, it was important to support this specific one, because it is truly important that the knowledge, the capabilities, and the potential of AI will not be subsumed to a certain part of the world. We need to make sure that we support, and that was certainly an objective of ours, that the knowledge, the potential of AI is unleashed and leveraged all over the world. And I'm glad to be here with a virtual room filled with people interested in carrying that on. And so I'll share my screen for my presentation. I'll just ask if everyone can see it.
Yes, we can.
Just okay?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. So for this first week, I'll be talking, and the request was to walk through the to AI till generative AI, so until what we have today. My name is Nuno Moniz. I'm an associate research professor with the Lucy Family Institute and director of the Notre Dame IBM Tech Ethics Lab. if you have any questions, requests after this talk that I won't be able to get to due to time constraints, feel free to send emails. I will do my best to answer as soon as possible. So whenever we talk about AI and its founding, we usually end up looking at an image such as this. This is an image from 1956 in Dartmouth College in the USA, which is essentially when the Dartmouth, this is the famous Dartmouth workshop happened, gathering those that were the minds that came up with the term artificial intelligence and drew up some of the main ideas then that are still pursued today. I wanted to just show you that one because I think there's a different idea of talking and thinking about this evolution of AI that we certainly should look into, because it's, although more complicated, is certainly more interesting and more informative also to where we are today. And speaking of today, I'll try to touch on these 3 points. So how did we arrive at AI? How has AI evolved until today? And I'll zoom in on the advent of generative AI. So first thing is, throughout history, we have dreamt mechanical beings and amazing capabilities. References from mythology and literature span ancient Greece, ancient China, Egypt. There's a ton of examples one could come up with. And just to better understand this, we have figures such as these ones. I'm sorry about the quality of the images, but just for us to grasp this. How was this mythical figure from Greece that was supposedly a brass robot measuring 30 meters high, that forged by the god of technology, Hephaestus, and that would roam the island of Crete to protect it against invaders. So here, this idea of automation and brass objects gaining life and performing human work or jobs or functions that would be limited to humans. Same thing here in the middle from Iliad, a masterpiece in terms of literature concerning more the side of automation purely as we usually describe it today. These were essentially automobile tripods that would take people to the assembly of gods and again return to their residence. There's this is certainly an example of automated driving for us and for us to be inspired. And finally, this on the right, Yanqi. Similar myths and stories can be found in ancient China also. And this is a particularly interesting one where a technician named Yanqi made a human-like robot that could dance and sing. And this was the downfall, flirt with the king's concubines. And it was interesting because its dismantling showed, as the myth goes, that only a single part, when a single part was removed, the robot would stop. So it was fully integrated. So variations of these types of stories are found abundantly in ancient cultures all over the world. And we certainly have a tendency to reinvent them, which is something of note. More recently, we have things like Leonardo da Vinci's work in terms of robotics, but we also have very interesting examples from folklore and from cartoons, from books. On the right, this is just for fun, but I don't know if you know this figure. This is Pinocchio, very known figure of fictional character. My son certainly knows about it. It was created in 19th century. and it had this idea that it was carved out of wood, and when it would tell lies, its nose would grow and all of that. So just to give you an example, that we have certainly been nudged, all of us in this room, by folklore, by radio, by newspapers, by books, by television, by the internet, into looking at technology and these possibilities of technology in a very positive way, in the sense of us being acceptant of these great promises of technology. And this is a good thing in terms of our imagination, but also sometimes not a very good thing in terms of us being misled about what these technologies can actually do. In 2019, I did this travel with friends, and there was a particular image. This was in Dallas, Texas, in the US. There's a mesh of this huge roads that when you look at it, and if you're driving, you'll be very afraid of driving into it, because you really don't, you're getting into one, but you don't know where you're getting out. And this is a bit how I feel the story of AI is, or should be studied. It's actually a development of a series of academic disciplines and practices that meshes together into a certain moment in time. And I mean, there's important contributions from philosophy, logic, biology, psychology, statistics, engineering. There's inputs from everywhere, but there are two particular ones that I wanted to pull out. First one is cybernetics. Norbert Wiener developed this concept, which was essentially defined as looking into the control and communication in the animal and the machine. It has many interpretations, but it had this parallel with feedback processes in biological and technological systems. And during the 1950s, this was a very big thing, primarily technical discipline, but worked a lot with other disciplines, especially biology. This was fragmented in the 60s and the 70s, but it was critical for AI, because AI ends up being a sort of a splinter, a cutoff from cybernetics and the debates that were happening at a certain time in cybernetics. And the other one is cognitive science. It has also a very ancient history, a lot of work in the 30s and 40s that was critical to AI, but it worked as both a metaphor for the mind and as a tool for investigation. So these two things, people critical of cybernetics and the rise of cognitive science, inspired a lot of people into what became AI. And so if we were in a room, a physical room, I would ask show of hands on who wants to take a stab at this one. So what is the definition of artificial intelligence, or how should we approach it? Because we're in a virtual one, I'll just say that there is no community-wide agreement on a definition, which is not surprising. But there are things we can uncover and discuss about this. We can start with intelligence, which is the same thing. There is no all-encompassing definition that everyone agrees. But this one that you have here is the result of very interesting work by a colleague, Dagmar Monet, in Berlin, that collected hundreds of definitions of intelligence, both machine and artificial, and then had a ton of people annotating it and searching for the one that would get the greatest level of agreement. And this was the one. So that intelligence, and I'll read it out, Intelligence is a very general mental capability that, among other things, involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. It is not merely book learning, a narrow academic skill, or test making smart. Rather, it reflects a broader and deeper capability for comprehending our surroundings, catching on, making sense of things, or figuring out what to do. I find this definition quite interesting because of the intuition part. So that it's not just having the knowledge, it's being able to leverage it against the unknown, against the unseen, and just, as it says there, figuring out how to approach problems, leveraging the knowledge and the experience that we have. Then we can go into artificial intelligence. And there's a definition from 2007 from John McCarthy, which is one of the people that coined the term artificial intelligence. And this is it, that it is the science and engineering of making intelligent systems, especially intelligent computer programs. And it's related to the similar task of using computers to understand human intelligence, but AI doesn't need to confine itself to methods that are biologically observable. So beyond the understanding biological phenomena or replicating or simulating them, there's other tasks, more mechanical, if you might, or automatic, that can be leveraged with artificial intelligence. Now, I wanted to bring this up here, the term of machine intelligence, because it is important to draw a line into what AI is. The concept of machine intelligence predates the concept of artificial intelligence. And this dates back to the early 40s. There was, for example, this notorious informal club called Ratio Club in Britain that joined a ton of statisticians, mathematics that talked about this concept. There's work from Alan Turing in this image about can machines think? And this was not a paper about exactly can machines think, but instead, can machines evolve to a point that they're indistinguishable between or with humans? So if you would have some structure where a human would be making questions and receiving replies, one from a artificial intelligence system, and the human, would this judge be able to discern, to separate those that came from the human and the automated system? There's a ton of critiques to this, and very appropriately so, but just wanted to draw that. And in 1948, there's this symposium that usually it's not talked about, but this is actually a very important one. Besides this idea of the mechanisms and behavior and its intersection with the computation and early computation, there's seminal work presented here that will be at the very core of the idea of artificial intelligence and what it could be. There are three events that I would like to share with you that I believe are the beginnings of AI. The first one is session on learning machines. This is an event in '55. It's essentially a session paired with the computer, a joint computer conference, which was a big thing then, which already had presentations and work presented that was, to a certain extent, included in what AI would be defined. There's already things here concerning pattern recognition, vision or computational vision, even chess playing programs. There's already things coming up here, but there's one important thing that should be talked about. In this session about learning machines, Willis Howard Ware, which was a pioneer in computation, privacy rights, and computer security, was the session chair. And after going through all of these presentations, it is very interesting that he noted important objectives that were necessary to achieve all of those goals and unleash the full potential that was being presented there. And these would include, for example, speed of operation, parallelism, computer memory. So interestingly enough, most of the issues that AI has found and bumped into over its 70 plus years of existence as an academic field were already laid out even before the term of artificial intelligence had been coined. Now, the second one is the founding or the coining of this term artificial intelligence. This was a process where John McCarthy in '54 got together with Marvin Minsky. They brought in two more senior fellows, Rochester and Claude Shannon, and made a proposal to organize this workshop at Dartmouth during the summer. This proposal was for a 2-month, 10-man workshop. It was accepted, not for the full funding that was requested, but it was accepted. And I should say that by all accounts from the people that were there, in terms of the objectives of this workshop, the workshop was not a success. They had very high hopes. That didn't pan out. But this is still a critical moment because it's the moment where the term is coined, where finally there's a name to call this intersection of ideas, practices, disciplines in pursuit of knowledge. And that is certainly something that is critical to the entire history of AI. And the final one is this mechanization of thought processes symposium in the UK. And I bring this up basically because it was the first international big moment for AI. This is 58. And although it has a lot of presence from researchers in the UK and USA, it also had presentations from the Soviet Union, from researchers from the Soviet Union, from higher ed in France and Israel. And so it was, to a great extent, the first time that AI went international. Now, a lot of excitement came from all of this. There's a few quotes here. Herbert Simon, Nobel laureate in economics: a digital computer will be the world's chess champion unless the rules bar it from competition. Well, it took 40 years, but it did happen. Within a generation, the problem of creating artificial intelligence will be substantially solved. Marvin Minsky, that is up for debate. Or that in 30 years, we should have machines whose intelligence is compared to man's. Well, this would be 98, and that's also a discussion if the intelligence or the simulation of intelligence that machines do today is comparable to ours, to us people. Now, some of these early research areas are in fact the research areas that we still find today. These were pattern recognition, heuristic programs, semantic representations, computer vision, game playing. But there's certainly one that is missing here because it wasn't a big thing in the beginning, which is machine learning. So the ability to extract rules from data and then reuse them for prediction, recommendation, and ton of other downstream tasks. What happened after this? We had great excitement. So we had mathematical models of the mind being proposed, computation models for this being proposed. But after around 15 years after the coining of this term, there's a sort of reckoning on the limitations of that time. both from the paradigm that was more the symbolic, the good old-fashioned AI. So you have symbols, you essentially manipulate them, but also because this promise of neural networks, researchers essentially found that it was very limited in the type of problems it could solve. And this was a very big moment that came with also a lot of critique. But the most important part, it came with a significant decrease in funding, in public funding, first from the UK, but then from the US, which were the two main powers looking into artificial intelligence. And this led to a winter, essentially a period of time of restrictions in terms of computational power, the ability to find cases where AI could be applied, but most importantly, because of the lack of funding. I should say that although we usually consider this a winter, it is also true that a lot of the evolution, a lot of the novelty that led us out of this AI winter were proposed during this time, or were being worked between these two periods. In the 80s, we have an interesting revamp of AI with expert systems. This idea that you could build a collection of rules and then use them as an automated system. So let's imagine, usually this is the example in health, for a diagnosis. Someone comes into a doctor, says, I'm feeling feverish, I have chills, I have this other symptom, and essentially each symptom would be matched against all of the rules or combination of these rules, heading then to a certain diagnosis. Now, funding came again, especially driven by the interest of the Japanese government, and other algorithms were proposed that created a new breath, a new life into AI. However, we came bumping again into reality, which was finding out in the latter part of the 80s and early 90s that these systems were still not meeting the expectations that were promised. Funding decreased once again, but this time the community was asking for a different approach to AI, essentially looking at what's done until then and discussing if that approach of symbols, manipulation of symbols, would be enough to reach the promise of AI. Which then leads to the advent of machine learning. Machine learning was coined in the 50s by Arthur Samuel, and there was work done since the beginning of AI, but it was, I believe it's acceptable to say, a fringe topic. That stopped with the beginnings of the 90s and the late 80s. There's a big surge in computation with the advent of the personal computer and the internet. Solutions to concrete problems start appearing, and already in the 2000s we have a data explosion, in terms of its production, its generation, but also its storage, and also in terms of compute power. This evolved into the topic of deep learning, which is something that dates back to the 80s, but for which compute power was not available. But in the early 2010s, that begins to be a possibility. Not only we have a lot of data, basically due to the advent of the internet, but we also start to have the compute power to solve concrete problems. Deep learning, I believe, is the best or the most significant example of this. This is essentially the idea that, I don't know if you've ever seen a depiction of an artificial neural network. Essentially, you have several nodes, which are the inputs. This is essentially the information that you provide. And then you have a network, a literal network. You have nodes organized in layers that are connected between layers. Now, in the beginning, this was essentially you have input nodes and one or two output nodes. This evolved into being a multi-layer network. And this is essentially what we call deep learning. For a long time, training these networks was not something that was feasible because of two things: lack of data and lack of compute. This period, beginning around 2010, but especially 2013-14, this has changed. And this is where we can probably pinpoint this, the beginning of generative AI. Now, this is up for debate. If we, I have here this definition from Wikipedia because I thought it was actually the best I could find, which is generative artificial intelligence is artificial intelligence capable of generating text, images, videos, or other data using generative models, often in response to prompts. Generative AI models learn the patterns and structure of their input, training data, and then generate new data that has similar characteristics. So if we look at this definition, we could actually say that generative AI has been here for a long time. Eliza, which is a very famous chatbot from the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, made headlines as being a psychologist or psychiatrist therapist. Essentially, people would go there, speak with this chatbot, and the chatbot would reply back in a way that was expected from a human. Now, this ELIZA program or the system is available online. You can look it up and see what it does. Again, essentially manipulation of symbols, and a very interesting trick, which is a lot of times replying to the prompts that humans were inputting by asking how they feel about it. So a very narrow kind of idea on what a chatbot would look like. But I should say that this idea of generative AI, of generating content and accurate content, changed a generation of scientists and researchers and practitioners and engineers. That there's a lot of background noise, which is a new advent in terms of the tools that can be built and the problems that can be solved. I am unsure about the degree of technical expertise that we all have in the room, but I wanted to give you a bit of a clue of how these things have evolved. This is essentially a timeline for us to understand how fast the evolution of generative AI was in the last decade. So if we position the introduction of artificial intelligence in the mid-50s, the first computational model of the human brain, or at least inspired by, is in 58. In 64, we have the ELIZA chatbot that I was speaking about, and it takes almost 20 years to create what is called neural networks. Essentially, is the idea of leveraging prior information into account when generating words. So essentially, instead of just what is the next word, it would leverage some type of context. In 97, a more complex architecture of this long short-term memory architecture is developed. This is still very much used, for example, in forecasting, a different type of problem. But it is here in the beginnings of the 2010s that specifically here in 2013, we see the advent of variational autoencoders. I won't go into details, but if you have questions about this or you want to know more details, I would be more than glad to provide them. This was followed by generative adversarial networks, which is very well known for being the kind of a big change in terms of the quality of images that AI systems could create. Diffusion models, so essentially this idea that you could introduce noise to improve the training process of these very large models. And then the transformers, which are the backbone of ChatGPT and others, is proposed. So all of the tools that are critical for the systems that today we're talking about, Midjourney, DALL-E, ChatGPT, everything of that sort, was actually proposed or initially proposed around 10 years ago. And here we have 2021, DALL-E is proposed, 22 Stable Diffusion and Midjourney, 23 ChatGPT 4, and then we have even more developments here. Just wanted to provide you some idea of what these things are. What are they doing? So when we look at things like variational autoencoders or just autoencoders to simplify, I'm going to try to translate this to kind of practical situations. And I know my time is essentially up, so I'll try to be very quick. The encoder-decoder architecture, this idea that if you have a very large number of images, you are essentially trying to ask this question. What is the least amount of information that I can use to describe this image? And so what happens is you try to condense the information from the original images, which are these on the left, and you use a neural network to try to compress that information into this representation. So this representation will be essentially uninterpretable by us if we would look at it, but it is trying to describe this image as best as it can. And then we have the other part, which is decoder, which is trying to get this smaller amount of information describing the images and reconstructing the original image. So the training of these models is essentially this process of improving the encoder and the decoder. It's like a struggle between both. Now, this is unsupervised. The idea is essentially we want the best match possible between input images and the images that are reconstructed. Okay, so essentially you would put an image into a model and you're expecting that on the other side, this image will appear as best as possible or as more similar to the original one as possible. GANs, the generative adversarial architecture, are very similar. The architecture is basically the same, but they function in a different way in the sense that the idea here is you have supervision, you have labels. These images have a certain label. And the idea here is the models, the encoding and decoding struggle will happen toward the direction of labels matching. Okay, so you expect that the data generated by these models will become more and more and more similar to the actual image. So very similar, but essentially the process or the final bit of the process is changed. Of course, I'm taking out a lot of technical details because there are other differences. Then we have the transformer architectures that are very famous now. Attention is all you need. Essentially, the idea here is you translate words into tokens, and then you bring in something that until now either wasn't taken into consideration or wasn't taken into consideration at the level that is taken with transformers, which is context. So here, the attention is all you need is the paper that launches the transformer architecture, is essentially a translation to this idea of context. So here I have the generated training examples, and you have here the inputs, the features, so the words, a sequence of words that are being slide one word every time, and this essentially creates a data set that is then used for training this architecture. Now, ChatGPT goes fairly beyond this because this is trained. The model will be trained in the sense of evolving into correctly predicting the next word based on the context it has before. But ChatGPT then has other things. It then has a human in the loop process where you have a lot of people annotating what is the best response that different versions of the possible models are providing. There's a ton of other modules that are brought in to provide this final solution that you then use, which is ChatGPT. Because this is a workshop rooted on the idea of these technical advances and technological advances, but also its use, there are a ton of ethical aspects that needs to be considered. I'll outline 6 here. We can talk about it in the Q&A, but one is accuracy. So how accurate are these systems? There's a lot of excitement, but it seems that every time that there's any evidence of this making a breakthrough, for example, in terms of pairing up to human ability, another work comes essentially describing how methodologically there's mistakes, or it's not exactly like that, or a different type of evaluation that shows exactly the opposite. Then there's a part of bias, which I think is one of the biggest here. These systems, the context of these systems is based on what computer readable information is most available. And that is the English language, which means that when we're looking at these systems and how they operate, it is something to take of note and bear in mind that the context that is being used to predict the following words has a lot of bias towards certain regions of the world, to certain languages, to certain even bibliography or literature that is being used to or leveraged to reply to these prompts that we're using. Then there's a question of volume. Essentially the amount of data that is required to build these systems, questions concerning cybersecurity or the way these systems can be used for doing illegal or just plain out wrong actions, a matter of intellectual property that is not small. This idea that a company can essentially use the product of imagination and sweat of artists, for example, or writers in any way that they want, may be very contentious. And the final one, which for me is something that strikes the most home, which is the societal impact, which is how the use of these tools impact not only pillars of our society like education, justice, health, etc., but how the interaction and its use from us using this system changes us in terms, for example, of how we acquire knowledge, how we debate, how we come up with new ideas, our critical judgment, our imagination. There are a ton of things that concern me because I don't know if you've ever heard of Amada's Law, and I'll finish with this, which is essentially, I'm paraphrasing, this idea that we tend to overestimate the short-term impacts of technology and underestimate the medium to long-term impacts of technology. And the use of technology has this perverse side, which is sometimes the ugliest side of it is not immediate. Sometimes it takes, well, pardon the redundancy, time for us to come to a sense on what is the impact of adopting and using these technologies. And this is something that I believe you're looking into, and that this workshop is a prime example of how we should approach, discuss, and learn together. Thank you so much. Hope this was great for you. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Nuno Moniz, for that insightful presentation. We'll have time for a few short questions. Yes, please unmute. Is it Daniel Ama Abasi? Please, I'm not using titles. I'm using the name I'm reading. So if you're a professor and I'm calling you by your first name, please just bear with me. Thank you. All right.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Moniz, for your wonderful presentation. My own is just a request whether we will be able to have the handouts from this lecture that is so wonderful, so that we can always be reviewing the lecture. I am appealing for a lecture note. Otherwise, the slide is sent to our mailboxes. Thank you.
Okay, I can answer that the slides, when we get it from Nuno, will be uploaded on the course page. We will not send materials to emails. Every book material will need to be accessed on the course page. So the recording of this session will also be on the course page. The slides will be on the course page. So everything about the course will be archived on the course page. It will be curated on the course page. Thank you.
It's okay.
Yes, Emmanuel Kwon Ndu, please unmute yourself. Thank you.
I just want, can you give a bit of explanation of how bias can affect big data, especially with that many of the generative artificial intelligence models are usually based on very big data. I don't know whether you get my question.
Sorry, I didn't hear exactly what the question was, but maybe Emmanuel, if you can write the question in the chat, I'll answer. Okay.
Let me do that.
Perfect.
We have Christy Muiwa. Could you just unmute and ask the question?
It's just interesting to note. I observed that he traced the history of AI to the 50s, that is from 1950 or something. But I was thinking during that era, it started with, is it that it started with the evolution of computers? Because I was thinking it's a recent invention. I didn't know that it started way back with the invention of computer. I just want to know more about that.
Yes, I think that's a critical part here. Sometimes, and this is related more to marketing. We look at these big companies and they come out with these solutions and they say, hey, this is brand new. No one has thought about it. It's completely new. And sometimes it is, even technologically speaking, but it doesn't mean that people haven't been doing that sort of things for a long time. I must say that the AI that was thought, dreamt of in the 50s is very much different than what we have today. These were, even in terms of paradigm, the way that people were trying to solve problems was very different. But it was also very tied to its relation to cognitive science. How can we use AI to simulate human processes, biological processes? How can we understand each other better? I think that at a certain point, especially when in the 80s, when it became clear that AI would, if not then, at a certain point in future, have a very big role to play in terms of industry and essentially value for companies. I think there was a shift, and then we started to observe increasing levels of marketing plays. Okay. And this is something that, from an ethical standpoint, from an education standpoint, we need, as educators, to be very wary and very conscious of. I think the key here is we need to be very informed. And it begins by being able to tell our students that this is not new. The promise of AI replacing humans, there's headlines in the New York Times in the 60s saying this. Okay? So we need to be very critical and essentially be able to provide the tools to our students, the critical expertise or capabilities to look at these systems and really make the hard question. What is the value of AI today for a common person? It's not an easy question to ask, but something interesting for us to look into. And thank you for the question.
Thank you. There's a question, an interesting ethical question in the chat that I'd like you to attend to, the one by Emmanuel. Okay. And then after that, I'll probably urge every other person to move the questions to the discussion forum so that we can do other things and close this session. So the question by Emmanuel is GAI models are based on big data sets. Don't you think that this can influence bias in the generated results? So I'm curious about the question because of the ethical implications.
It certainly is. It certainly influences. I can give you an example. I am now doing a research project with a colleague in Croatia. We're essentially looking at how AI may serve as memory modulation tools. I don't know if you know the concept of memory modulation, but it's essentially what is used after, for example, conflicts where who wins changes education notebooks, history, raises monuments, changes the museums to tell a certain narrative of history that should, in theory, bring the peoples together. Okay, so we now have a united idea of history. You can move forward and build prosperous times. And we were wondering to what an extent ChatGPT and others would serve as modulation tools, as memory modulation tools. What we found is very interesting things. For example, ChatGPT is horrible at telling the stories of conflict. Not because there aren't events that are true, but because it makes causal links on that history of the conflict that are just plain wrong. It makes up events that never existed. It brings in historians or historical facts in literature that don't exist to support its claims. And there are very interesting things like, for example, if you change the language, like, for example, the history of the US-Vietnam War. If you ask the exact same questions using English or Vietnam, you get two different narratives. Interesting thing, if you ask for the systems to tell the story backwards instead of with the arrow of time, you also get different stories and narratives. So, as educators, once again, These are the type of things that we should be very clear when we're talking with students. And I can give you an example. I don't forbid my students of using ChatGPT, but I do warn them that it makes a lot of mistakes and that there's no, it was ChatGPT that told me rule or excuse. You are responsible, as with any book, because even published books may have mistakes. It is up to you to be critical and informed enough to make the question, this doesn't sound exactly correct, or this doesn't match other sources. What is happening here? So the responsibility is on the student in this case, because they need to be made responsible. If they are already aware that this makes mistakes, and this is many times because of bias, but also, I should say, because there's a foundational lacking in terms of the technology for it to be trustworthy. I know it's cool. I know it spits out a lot of interesting and a lot of correct things, but it still has a foundational lacking of stability and something that should lead us to trust these systems in terms of you make a question, you copy paste the answer, and that's okay. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Moniz. Ladies and gentlemen, you agree with me that he has tried to provide as detailed responses as possible to all our queries. We still have a lot more questions coming up in the chat room, and some people could not ask their questions. But what I will recommend is that we move our discussions to the discussion forum that has been created for this course. As you well know, that this guest presentation is to foreground the conversation for the week, and I think Dr. Moniz has done that brilliantly. He deserves a round of applause, even if it's a virtual one, from all of us. Thank you for doing this.